From ImpactAlpha, it's This Week in Impact, where we bring you some of the most interesting impact investing stories of the week. It's Friday, July 11th. I'm Brian Walsh, and I'm joined this week by ImpactAlpha editor David Bank. We'll discuss, in the wake of the recent tragic floods in Texas, the new urgency around investments in climate adaptation and resilience. Plus, how community development financial institutions in Indian country are positioned to step up, even without promised federal funds. And finally, how family offices engage in impact investing during perilous times. Highlights from David's recent interview with Blue Haven Initiative's Liesel, Pritzker, Simmons. That's all coming up on This Week in Impact. Hi, David. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, Brian, but it's been a heavy week.
Indeed, it has. It's been a week since the flash flood struck Texas's Hill Country in the early morning hours of the 4th of July, leaving at least 120 people dead, including more than 24 children. As our Amy Cortese reported for us in ImpactAlpha this week, investments in adaptation and resilience require new urgency as the climate future arrives. As those recovery efforts continue in Texas, local, state, and federal officials are facing questions about insufficient warning systems in a region known as Flash Flood Alley, as it has long experienced deadly floods. David, this raises a broader question about this era we're living under, with climate change impacting the likelihood and severity of significant weather events. While there are investments being made to prevent climate change, what does the market look like for investments aimed at reducing the worst consequences of climate change?
Yeah, Brian, it's just been heartbreaking to see the reports, and it's hit close to home for folks in the ImpactAlpha community as well. And there's always 20/20 hindsight, and you can think of things that should have been done. And I don't know that we really want to go there, but I do think that there's a kind of urgency now to think through what it means to be living, in this climate catastrophe. I mean, I think we're through the 1.5 degrees Celsius increase of global temperatures that folks said, kind of set off the cascades of catastrophes. And in fact, we're seeing those. And so these things that were kind of 100-year, 500-year events are happening fairly regularly. And I think the wake-up call is we're in it. We have to be ready for it. And so there's all kinds of things that can make it more survivable, I guess, is one way to put it, or increase community resilience to floods, to wildfires out here in California and elsewhere, and to droughts in many parts of the world. And it always seems to be either too much water or not enough is the problem. And those things range all across from analytics and sensors and predictive things to risk models and insurance, to fire tech and fire prevention, to water resource management, and then all kinds of kind of risk planning and kind of infrastructure, management. And again, it all sounds kind of wonky. It's really not that different from how communities have always kind of organized their resources and their infrastructure. It's just now with a kind of heightened awareness of what the increased climate risks are. And again, it's both public, it's private, and there's a variety of financing mechanisms. I guess people are calling it people talk about inevitable surprises, and now people talk about sort of the inevitable opportunity in climate resilience.
Now, this term climate resilience, I have to confess there's a little bit of confusion on my part about some of the jargon in the space, because we hear about climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and climate resilience, and different investments along those three different concepts. Can you help break down those concepts for me so I can better understand what we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I always think it's odd, to compare sort of the climate resilience and adaptation investments to the climate mitigation, because they're kind of different things. Mitigation, of course, means, reducing the carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emissions, methane and things, so that we can slow the progress of global warming overall. And that's a whole, economy and a whole marketplace of its own, particularly obviously in things like renewable energy and clean power, but also decarbonization of industries and other kinds of things like that. And that has to go on. We have to reach, a kind of net zero, as people know, by about 2050, if we're, or probably sooner. And that's a whole investment landscape and marketplace of its own.
So that's essentially stopping climate change before it gets worse.
Well, slowing the progress of, yes.
All right, so let's talk then about climate adaptation.
Well, that just means that, regardless at this point of whether we can get to those carbon reductions, and there's no particular evidence that at a global level we're getting there. We haven't even peaked yet, much less started the decline, and much less, gotten the very dramatic compounding declines that are needed by, 2030 and then 2050. So the climate effects, the climate catastrophe, as people call it, is upon us now and will be no matter what we do. And that's brought the focus back to things that can make those events more survivable, make communities more resilient. It's interesting, there's now a lot of talk of places that are uninsurable. People are having their fire insurance or their homeowners insurance canceled out here in California and parts of Florida for flooding and whatnot, and it affects housing prices, obviously, and the whole housing market. But it also works in the other way. So if you put in things like wildfire prevention programs, you can reduce, your insurance premiums, or if you build better, flood water management systems, then your community will be more appealing and desirable than ones that don't have it. So there's kind of both a downside and an upside. And then, of course, one of the ironies of these things is that those kinds of investments get more valuable, kind of the worse things get, right? So if you've got the resilient food supply, because you're either have, crop varieties or maybe say greenhouses or whatnot, and in a world of, of food shortages, your food is going to become more valuable. Same with fresh water supplies and the rest of it. So it's a little bit of a strange market in that, your investments pay off, the worse things get.
Right. So that's climate adaptation, where you're, essentially living with the effects of climate change and reducing our sensitivity to it. So then take us through climate resilience.
Those things are more or less just kind of like I said, what infrastructure kind of investments that communities make in their stormwater, in their fire prevention, and those things are getting more baked in just into what folks have to do, what cities have to do, and for their municipal bond ratings, what communities have to do for their fire insurance premiums. There's all kinds of pricing signals and pricing mechanisms that are slowly and probably belatedly kind of coming into focus, and that are making folks do kind of what are common sense things. And obviously, one of the most common sense things is early warning systems for flood zones and that sort of thing. So those are the kinds of investments that I think you don't have to have any particular opinion about the causes of of global warming or what should happen with the fossil fuel industry to say that there should be early warning systems for known flood zones.
Right. So no matter what your political stance on the cause of climate change, even if you don't believe in climate change, that maybe perhaps some of the government officials in Texas, where this recent disaster hit, you still believe in the need to respond to these natural disasters.
Yeah, I don't see how anybody could argue with that. And it does seem to have bipartisan support. And of course, because it's a very tangible local issue, and so politicians do have to respond to that. And so I think there is kind of an emerging, sort of consensus around kinds of things that have to be done. Now, of course, there's still budget constraints, and in fact, we're seeing at the federal level, FEMA being defunded and decommissioned just when it's needed most.
All right. Well, you can read Amy's piece about investments in climate adaptation and resilience on impactalpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. For now, let's take a quick break. When we come back, how community development financial institutions in Indian country are positioned to step up, even without promised federal funds. Community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, provide crucial funding for people, organizations, and businesses in local communities across the U.S. that are often underserved by traditional commercial banks. These communities include Indian country. And as Impact Alpha's Eric Stein reported this week, many of the 69 federally certified native CDFIs are poised to step up and offer the types of financing needed by farmers, small business owners, housing developers, and other enterprises in Indian country. David, this is despite the Trump administration's recent cutback in federal funding for community finance. So, why are some native CDFIs optimistic about the opportunity before them?
Well, Brian, yeah, there's been a lot of excitement around, kind of economic development and access to finance in Indian country on reservations and through tribal mechanisms like these local native CDFIs that have really grown up in recent years and become, some of them quite large and sophisticated financial institutions, making loans for ranchers and farmers, for small businesses, for housing and other kinds of developers, and really sparking a kind of renaissance in some Indian communities. And part of that, or a large part of that, was a function that the Biden administration in particular had carved out financing help to get these local financial institutions, to be able to scale up and increase their lending and thus increase the economic activity. And some of that has been clawed back, but like in some other sectors that we've seen, the ramp up itself as folks got ready for a sort of new wave of lending, that kind of creates its own momentum. And so the deals they were going to finance, the companies that were getting started, a lot of these are, say, like food processing companies to help retain more of the value for agricultural producers, or Navajo Power, which is taking advantage of the kind of ample solar capacity on some reservation lands. Those kinds of deals still make sense, and so these native CDFIs are saying, "Hey, yeah, some of the deposits and other money that we were expecting from the feds may not be coming through, but if we can still underwrite a deal and get repaid for our loans, let's do it." So there's kind of at least a kind of a rallying cry to keep the momentum going, even despite some setbacks.
And where are some of the other sources of capital coming into these tribal CDFIs coming from?
Well, here's a good example that Eric highlighted in the piece, and it comes out of Spruce Root, which is a native CDFI in Southeast Alaska, and they've stood up the Seacoast Trust, and it's raising something like $100 million. I think they've gotten a decent part of the way there. And so something called Sealaska, which is the Southeast Alaska Native Regional Corporation, put out a kind of matching pledge of $10 million. And the Nature Conservancy a few years back stepped up with $8 million to match it. And now they've raised another chunk from other investors as well. And it's an interesting example of a conservation organization like the Nature Conservancy understanding that indigenous people and native tribes actually play a huge role in preserving ecosystems and natural resources. And it's kind of making an alliance there of this native CDFI conservationists and others to invest in kind of the economic well-being and also the ecological well-being. And so there are, innovative and kind of inventive ways of packaging these kinds of opportunities, and the CDFIs are able to raise money from corporations that can put their cash deposits there, from banks in some cases through CRA type allocations, and then from native businesses themselves. There's lots of money now flowing into native lands and to opportunities. And just on that basis, one of the things that the CDFIs are doing is helping tribes negotiate these tribal benefits agreements. And they're like community benefit agreements that exist elsewhere, but it basically specifies the kinds of rights and shares of the upside and other kinds of terms of these deals for developers who do want to take advantage of resources and opportunities in Indian country. And so the whole thing is kind of getting a little bit more regularized and normalized, and I think also maybe equalized in the sense of who benefits from the deals.
All right, super interesting. You can read Eric's piece on native CDFIs on impactalpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. What's your take? Impact Alpha subscribers can weigh in on the conversation on our Slack channel. For now, let's take one more quick break. When we come back, highlights from David's recent conversation with Liesel Pritzker Simmons, whose family office has been an impact investing trailblazer for more than a dozen years. David, you spoke recently with Liesel Pritzker Simmons, who, along with her husband Ian Simmons, runs their family office known as the Blue Haven Initiative. Blue Haven is well known in impact investing circles, backing more than 30 impact fund managers, making direct investments, and starting or joining coalition efforts like Policy Enhanced Impact Investing, The Impact, TrimTab, and the Catalytic Capital Consortium. So, David, how is Liesel influencing other family offices?
Yeah, we were interested in catching up with Liesel because she's been, notably outspoken on the kind of responsibility of wealthy families and family offices to be involved in policy and even in politics. And her husband, Ian Simmons, is very kind of civically engaged on things like, voter turnout and redistricting fairness and money in politics and things. So, given what people are calling the current environment, we were interested in how Blue Haven is navigating the perilous times, as people are saying. And Liesel, had a very common sense, matter of fact way of looking at it. For starters, long term perspective. Solar, for example, costs are declining, whether the tax credits in place or not, as is the case. Through the recent tax bill that made it through Congress and that President Trump signed. But that doesn't mean solar is not a good investment, and if you have a long-term perspective. And so there were those kinds of things. But she also was arguing for impact investors to kind of join the fray on the policy front. And as you mentioned, there's something called policy enhanced impact investing, which Blue Haven helped set up. And it basically says that there's lots of things that might be happening at state legislative levels or local levels, not just federal, that will have a material effect on your portfolio performance, whether it's nuances of a fair lending law in Illinois was one example. And the GPs, the fund managers, don't necessarily have the wherewithal to do that kind of policy work, whether it's lobbying or just development of the policies. And that's something that a family like the Pritzkers, for example, might have some expertise in. And so Lisa said, let's put those two parts of our portfolio together and help our general partners navigate and execute on some of these policy things. And so now she's brought other family offices into that approach as well. So a lot of what she's up to is mobilizing other family offices to kind of be more responsive and nimble in this time.
Right, and so that's been an interesting transformation for Blue Haven, which started as more of a market rate investor, and now they're being more of a field builder of sorts.
Yeah, she had a kind of explanation of the journey and made what it again is a kind of common sense observation, which is how do you tell the difference between a catalytic so-called investment and something that's just a market rate investment that didn't work out that well. And it's a sort of intellectual and but also practical problem if you're trying to allocate money. And so they eventually Blue Haven has sort of expanded its toolkit from just market rate investing, and they've become pretty active as a catalytic investor themselves. I think there's something like $18 million, not a lot, but still a chunk of their portfolio that's allocated to that. And they've joined something called the Catalytic Capital Consortium, which also backs ImpactAlpha's coverage of catalytic capital. And then through kind of family association called the Impact, they helped incubate fund of funds. It's called TrimTab, and it is a fund of impact funds, and it's a way for families, family offices, and others who have a desire to be more in the kind of deep end of the impact pool to allocate that capital without having to have the kind of sophisticated back office, deal structuring capacity that these catalytic deals require. So it's kind of a one-stop shop if you want to just put the catalytic money down and let the folks who've got some experience doing it put it to work.
That's super interesting. But one thing that struck me most about your interview with Liesel was her advocacy for a global wealth tax. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, Liesel is kind of, unusual and outspoken for a billionaire, and Forbes does peg her wealth at about $1.5 billion, and she's in favor of a global wealth tax. And she mentioned, people talk about system change. Impact investors love system change. They're not so eager to talk about a global wealth tax sometimes. Here's what she had to say.
Taxing wealth more is wildly popular on both sides of the aisle across different demographics. It's like, hopefully one day it will happen, but I would love a little bit more noise from the impact investing family office space around this one. This one still gets a little like, please will settle down when I bring it up, because you're giving up power. But that, I don't think we can ever have a conversation, certainly not about, I don't want anybody to talk to me about systems if they're not going to bring up taxes.
Taxes, taxes, taxes. Very much a big part of the overall system that we're in, and impact investing can only do so much without talking about taxes. All right, well, you can read the write-up of David's interview with Liesel, Pritzker, Simmons on ImpactAlpha.com. There's also a link in our show notes. But for now, that's going to do it for this episode of This Week in Impact. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Brian. It's always great to be with you.
And thank you all for listening. This Week in Impact is a production of Impact Alpha and part of the Impact Alpha podcast network. Smart conversations by and for impact investing professionals. For exclusive stories and insights about the world of impact investing and sustainable finance, join thousands of other agents of impact by subscribing. Just go to impactalpha.com/subscribe for full access. Thanks, as always, to our producer extraordinaire, Isaac Silk. For David Bank, I'm Brian Walsh, Managing Director of the impact advisory firm Human Nature. We'll see you next week for more Impact.